In this video, I'm going to walk you through everything you need to know about working with the API connector. The API connector is a plugin that you'll want to install in your app if you want to create custom integrations with external services. This is a tool that allows you to make API calls, whether it's to receive data from an external source or trigger actions. Okay, so you'll notice that I'm in the plugins tab. You'll go to add plugins and search for the API connector. It's a free plugin, obviously published by Bubble, so that you can make your custom API calls to an external service. So as a quick overview, so you understand kind of the windows that we'll be looking at, let's say that I wanted to add a custom connection to Stripe. So I would click on add another API. And here I'll give it a name. This is just an internal name for my own reference, so I can just type in Stripe here. I typically just like to put the name of the service there. We have a list of preset authentication systems, so you'll want to refer to the documentation for a lot of things when you're working with the API connector. The documentation for the external service should really guide you through all of the requirements about how to properly format your API requests. One of the most important things to look at is the authentication system and requirements for making those requests. Bubble's preset list here handles the vast majority of, all the popular, most common authentication systems. Now, you may run into some services that don't have an authentication requirement, in which case you would just select none or self-handled, or the authentication requirement is more complex. The presets don't exactly fit it or handle everything exactly. So you can select this here again so that you can do your own authentication system within the calls. Okay, now we have separate videos that will go over authentication in more detail. I do recommend you look at that so you know what to expect there. In this video, we're going to go through really just the understanding all the settings and how to work with this tool here using an example API that has no authentication requirement. That's going to be this one right here, REST countries, which is basically an open API to receive a lot of information about all the countries in the world. So, there you can see actually right here, their names, the currencies that they use, the languages they speak, bordering countries. We'll take a look at the data a little bit more closely in a second here. So once you've added your API, then you can start to add calls to that API connection. So a call is it's an individual request, either to receive data from that service or to make something happen in that service. You can send data out and create resources in that external service or update records in that external service. So it kicks you off here with a first initial call. You want to expand this window and give your call an internal name. So for example, if I wanted to create a subscription, that would be my internal name here. And then I would configure the call to communicate with Stripe with the right address. We'll take a look at examples here. To make the call to the right address and send all the information properly so that a subscription can actually get created in Stripe. Of course, Stripe is going to require some authentication so that it knows which account to communicate with to generate those details. If I want to make a separate call to a different resource, I would click on this button here, add another call, and then start the process over. So for example, maybe I want to get invoices for a customer or just in total over my entire account, and I would configure the call for that endpoint specifically. Okay, so you just add different calls for anything you want to do with that API. If I wanted to integrate with a different service altogether, I would add another API and again start the process all over. Maybe I want to communicate with my MailChimp account, select the authentication system, and this is a separate connection here. When you have hooked up these APIs, you're essentially creating either new actions in your workflows area or new data sources that you can use as repeating group data sources, even as your data structure field value types. A lot you can do from here. Okay, it's very similar to just installing a plugin that hooks into a service, but this is a way for you to customize your integration because you have complete control. API connector is great if you just need to do more with that external service. I mean, there are a lot of plugins out there that already connect to Stripe or already connect to MailChimp, but they may not cover everything you want. Some of these API capabilities are vast. They have lots of different endpoints, and the plugins may only cover a specific number of endpoints or a limited segment of the API offering. And so with the API connector, you can add whatever calls you want because you're making a direct connection. Just be very mindful of the documentation with that service because that is supposed to guide you through everything. Okay, so let's actually delete these here. I'm going to do just a single connection with the REST countries API so we can take a look at all of these settings. So I'm going to change the name of this to REST countries, like that, and I'm going to remove this action and confirm that, and we're going to start this one over here. We're going to create our first call to get all countries. Okay, so if I go into the documentation, I'm on the latest version. Very important to stay on the latest version as much as possible. These are all of the endpoints available to me. So an endpoint is an address. It's an address to a specific resource to receive data or to make something happen. In this case, with this API, everything is just about receiving data. We're not creating an account with this service. We're not updating country information from our end. We're just receiving the information. So if I go to the first resource here, all resource, we can see the address to get all of the country data. Unfiltered, we get absolutely everything. Now, if you look at this, it looks like a regular web address, and it is. If I go to this in a separate tab, which I have open here, you can see this is the response. It's just this raw data of all the country information in a JSON structure. Take a look at my scroll bar. It's very tiny because we have a lot of data on this page. Okay, so if I take that same address and paste it into my endpoint field here, let me make sure I copy this like this and paste it here, then I can receive the same data as an API response. Okay, so before going into any of these other settings, just right out of the gate, I'm going to click on Initialize Call. This is going to make an API request. So Bubble is going to make a request to this endpoint, and REST countries is going to receive that request and send back a response to us. So I'll click on Initialize, and we're going to see a pop-up, and hopefully, there we go, we have a successful response because we can see this country information. Okay, now if we take a look at what we're seeing here, we have every single field that is being defined in this list parsed out for us. It's very helpful because it's a lot easier to read, and also Bubble is auto-detecting the format of these fields, and Bubble does a really good job with this, but you do have the ability to change how Bubble works with that field if it has not picked up the structure properly. For example, sometimes numbers and text can get mixed up or dates can get mixed up. So pay close attention to those, because if there's a field in here that should be recognized as a date and Bubble has picked it up as a text, make sure to change it to a date so that you can actually use it as a date value in your application. You can do date math with it. You can put it on a calendar, things like that. Now, when you receive a list of data, in this case, we've gotten a list of countries, not just one. Bubble's going to show you the first item in the list here, all parsed out with their values below each of the fields. Lots and lots and lots of fields here. Let's scroll to the very bottom. I'm going to actually pick up my scroll bar, go to the very bottom here, and you have the option to click on Show Raw Data. When you click on this, Bubble's going to show you the full response. Now, it's going to take a moment because we do have a lot of data here. It's just loading it in. We're going to give it a little bit of time to pull it all in, but you'll be able to see everything, essentially what I saw in the web page. All right, there we are. So this is, now you can see it more as a JSON structure with all of the field keys and then their values, comma separated, some arrays, the nested lists within one another, the objects that might be listed with other objects. All right. So once you've received a successful response like this, make sure to click on Save. Okay. Now this call is initialized. Now I can use it in my application. Now for this one, I'm using it as a data source. So what does this mean? Well, let me go into my design. I'm going to add a repeating group to my page. And the type of content, I'm just going to search for the data source here. So I'm going to search for get all countries. This is the name of my call. The data source is going to come from an external API, right? This is not part of my built-in database. It's not an option set. It's a data source from an external API. So that's what I'll choose. And then I'll look for the provider. You may have other ones that you see here if you have other plugins installed or other API connections, but I'll go to the one that I want, REST countries, get all countries. And now inside of my cell, let me open up some more cells here. Let's do like 20 items at a time here. I'm going to add a text in here to display the country name. Let's do the country name and the capital. So inside this cell, I can display the current cell's country, and then we'll do the common name. Notice that we have all of the fields that came in from that structure, right? I don't have to set those up individually because from the initialization, Bubble learned the structure of the data that came in. And then let's also display the capital, yes, here. Okay, so now I'm going to preview the page. And what happens now, because this is set up as a data source in the repeating group, the moment I load the page, Bubble is going to make that API request to get that data again, and then display the response in my repeating group. Now, I have set my repeating group to just be fixed to 20 items, so it's only going to show me the first 20 in that response. So here we go. We see the country name and the capital listed there. This is a real-time call to that API resource. This is not pulling from my database in any way. Now, let's take a look at some of these other settings in the API connector so you know how these all work together. Use as data versus action is a Bubble instruction. This information is not sent to the external service. This is simply to tell Bubble, do we want to use this response as a data source or do we want to use it as an action in the workflow? It started out as a data source because I want to be able to populate a repeating group with these details. But I can also use this as an action instead. So I can clear this out. Let's have a button, right, to trigger a workflow to show countries like this. Whoops, I did not spell that correctly. There we go. And if I change this plugin or this action here to be used as an action, or I should say change the call to be used as an action, now my button can trigger this call as a workflow action, and the result of that action is the data response. So here I'll go to plugins, and now I have this available here. Remember, what you set there as that use as dropdown is what will dictate whether it's available here in the plugins area for the workflows or as a data source, an external data source, such as in the repeating group data source. So I'll select this action here. There's nothing else to configure. There will be at times calls where you have other parameters that you have to define. And as a result of this, I'll get all of the data, but I need to update my repeating group. So I would add another action here to display list in my repeating group the result of the previous step. Okay, so this is two different ways of passing data to that repeating group. It just depends on the flow that you need, or whether the user should have control over that interaction. If we wanted something to display as soon as the repeating group is shown, or when they click on this button, which you can see now that I've clicked on it, it's working, it's making that API call. The data, there is a lot of data on this particular endpoint, so it takes a couple of moments. But then once it does, it's going to pass that data to the repeating group, and we see the same result there. Okay, so that is the difference between use as action versus data. Now, the data type is telling Bubble the format of the response. Most of the time, it's going to be in JSON format. So what we see here is a JSON structure. So you've got, the brackets and the curly brackets, the quotation marks and the fields separating the key name from the values. Things are comma separated. Most of the time, like I said, it will be in JSON structure. Refer to the documentation so you make sure that you're telling Bubble to receive it in a proper format. Sometimes data will come back in XML. There may be times that specific calls will only send back a file or an image. And so in that case, you can choose, image or file here. Very rarely will you receive information back as a number or a plain text, but there are cases where that happens. The most common type of request where you can expect an empty response is if you're deleting something. So if you make a call to an endpoint where the method is delete, it's possible that the service will just not return a response, even if it successfully achieves that delete function. You want to tell Bubble, hey, we're not expecting a response so that it can initialize properly. Okay, so again, you'll have to refer to the documentation to understand whether that's what's going to happen with that call. Okay, I'm going to change this back to the get type and change this back to JSON. Again, most of the time it's a JSON structure. Now, this dropdown here is how you define your methods. So these are the 5 different methods. Get is typically to retrieve information. Post is typically to create information, sometimes to update as well. Put and patch are pretty interchangeable. Again, just refer to the documentation. It will tell you what method to use for your calls, but they're typically to update information, to modify. And then delete is self-explanatory. It's going to delete resources. Now, the rest countries documentation is all for things for retrieving info. I have the Stripe documentation open to show you an example of a resource here with many different endpoints with lots of different methods that you can work with. So for example, if we wanted to work with products in Stripe, they've got a nice summary of all the different endpoints and the methods that are used for them. Notice that for some endpoints, such as v1/products, v1/products, it's the same endpoint, but with a different method, different things are going to happen. So it's really important that you use the right method. So if I wanted to create a product, I would go to, this endpoint here, v1/products, and select post. That would require me to pass information about the new product I want to create, such as the name of the product, pricing details, things like that. Versus if I wanted to just retrieve all my products, there's less information that I'm required to send over, maybe some filters if I want, they could be optional, but this is a get call. Okay, so those methods are very important to tell the service what you want to do with this endpoint. Now, headers and parameters are a way for you to send data to the external service. Again, refer to the documentation to understand the requirements. Headers are typically where you'll add in authentication details or formatting details, right? You can send your data over to that service with a specific format. Typically, it's going to be in JSON. A lot of APIs assume that you're going to send it in JSON, so you don't necessarily need to identify that, but some services will require you to define the type of content. And again, it will show you in the documentation how to format it all. And we'll have plenty of examples to show you in the next few videos here. So headers are typically for like metadata and formatting details. The parameters are going to be for the body of your request. So typically information that is more unique to the call. So again, if I wanted to create a Stripe subscription, it's going to have the customer that I want to create it for, the plan that I want them to be associated with, and so on. Okay. This checkbox here for including errors in the response is specifically if you know that there may be times where the API request does not return a successful response. Maybe because the data that was passed in dynamically from your user was left blank or it was in an incorrect format, and you need to be able to continue the workflow if that happens versus stopping the workflow if it runs into an issue. Okay, so checking this box will allow the workflow to continue even if the response returns an error. Now, of course, you don't want to initialize the call where it's never going to be successful. Make sure that you set this up so that it does pass everything through in a successful way. But there might be times where if you expose aspects of this call to be more dynamic, and there's a possibility that an error returns because the dynamic values are not formatted properly, then you can check this box to keep the rest of the workflow going through versus cutting it off. Capturing the response headers is not something that you'll do very frequently, but just like you can pass header information to the service can send back header information to you. Now, this information is typically things like info about the server, dates and times, metadata, really. Most of the time, you don't need the information in the headers when you're working with the response. Let's see if REST countries returns anything here if we check this box. You'll notice that I do need to reinitialize this. So I'm going to click on that button. We'll wait for the response here and see if we get any headers. So you'll notice now all of the other content is now under a body resource. And I'm going to go down to the very bottom of this list. And you can see right here, just a few fields coming from the headers, the date of the request, the server it's coming from. Here's the format of the response. It's in a JSON structure. It's giving us the size of the data, right? So again, this is metadata that you typically don't need to work with, but there are some services that may send important information that you need, and that's why Bubble exposes this. But by default, it's turned off because it's not very common. Okay, now anytime you make a change to a call and you see this red message come up, make sure you do reinitialize it, otherwise you won't be able to use it in your application. Now, very rarely will you need to manually enter in your response. So what this is for is for you to put in the structure of the response so that Bubble can understand it and pull up, the window, which we'll see here in a moment, just like this, right? What you really want to do instead is initialize it by making a call so that an actual request goes out and you receive a real response, and Bubble learns the structure of that response properly. When you manually enter the response, there's more risk of you not formatting it properly and the connection not working when it's running in real time. But there are some cases where, maybe it's not possible to initialize a call and you have to anticipate it yourself. You just got to be very careful with that formatting there. Okay. Let's take a look at another example going to the REST countries documentation, one where we may have a dynamic piece of information. So for example, here under name, the endpoint is v3.1/name, and then we have a dynamic value in the endpoint where we have to provide some name. For example, Peru or United, and it will give us responses for anything that matches that name. So how do we make this dynamic in our application? Well, I'm going to grab this so we can get started with it. I'm going to create a new call and give this an internal name of get countries by name. Okay, and I'll paste this value in. Now, this piece here is expecting a name, right? This is more of a placeholder for a dynamic value. To make this dynamic in Bubble, we actually want to put hard brackets. You can see that's what this is for, this instruction. Use hard brackets for parameters. So I'm going to put a left hard bracket and a right hard bracket there. And now Bubble will create a new dynamic field that I can manipulate. So if I type in Peru, because I do need to initialize this with some value to get started, and initialize this call here, we're going to see the responses. Yeah, that came back a lot faster because the response is a lot smaller. Now I have all the details about Peru, like that. Okay, and I can show all the raw data for that there. If I want my user to be in control of this, let's take a look at this here. Let's go to our design. I'm going to move this over, and let's give the user an input for them to type in their own country name. And since I know I'm going to receive, I can receive one or more countries, I'm also going to do a repeating group here. So for example, if we did United, there are multiple countries with the word United in it. So we're going to do, let's just do maybe less rows here. This, okay. And in this case, I'm going to use this as an action. So I'm going to have a button, and we'll say show results like this. All right, so this is going to trigger my plugin action. Oh, look, it's not available for me in my list here because it's not set up as an action. So let's change this to action. Okay, and now I'm going to go back to plugins and select get countries by name. So that's my other call. And take a look at this. I don't have anywhere to insert the custom country name that the user is typing into the input. What I need to do is go to this call and make sure that this dynamic field is not private. That's all this means, is that it exposes it in wherever you're using the call. So whether it's a data source or if it's an action, now this field is available. Now you also see how Bubble has pre-populated this with the word Peru because that's what I have here in the API connector. It's kind of auto-filling that in. If you don't want that to happen, click on Allow Blank. I usually recommend checking this box so that there's no crossed wires with your setup dynamic in the data sources or in the workflows with these placeholders that you initially set up the call with. If you select Allow Blank, you can keep a value here for testing or initializing with, but it's not going to pass it into the action. So that way, if the user leaves their input blank, it doesn't fall back on Peru, for example. It just falls back to nothing. So here I'm going to insert my dynamic data now, and I'm going to pull from this input. Now I'm going to display data in my second repeating group. Let's actually rename this real quick. So this is going to be RG search countries, and my type of content does need to match my data type, which is a separate call, right? But it's not the same as the other call. It's now get countries by name, and that's the data source I'm defining here in the workflow. So here I'm going to go to the search countries repeating group, and the data source is the result of my first step. And the information inside, I think, is all going to match. So the name and the capital, yes. Okay, so let's preview this page and search for the word United, because I know that that's going to give us several results. So we can see this dynamic thing here. So I'll type in United, show results. There we go. All of the countries that may have the word United in it. Great. And we can also see that Mexico and Tanzania showed up here because in their official names, there are the words United. I believe United Republic of Tanzania and United States of Mexico, I believe, is listed there within the data. So if we were to type in, a more specific, let's say United States here, we have a more filtered view. Or if I type in Peru, right, we only get that one country back. So now we have a dynamic connection with the API where the user is inserting this value to change the endpoint, right? To change that address because the documentation here is allowing for it. You can provide whatever you want after this final slash, and then you can customize that there. Now, you may also run into parameters that have to be supplied with the call as well. So an example of that would be here when we're retrieving countries by their country codes. Here's the endpoint, right? /alpha, and then the question mark begins parameters. Here's only one parameter, the parameter for codes, and you can supply a list of the codes. That's different from a single code being a part of the endpoint, right? / then code. Some calls may actually have multiple parameters, and that's actually quite popular when you're working with post calls or put or patch calls if you're updating things, creating resources. The parameters are how you pass in all of the information you need to make things happen in that external service. So sometimes parameters will be passed in as a part of the endpoint where you have question mark and then your parameters. So you could have codes and then another parameter after that with its values and another parameter after that. Here's another example. Searching for countries by full name, you could say full text is true or false, basically saying we're providing a full name versus a partial name. So this is one way to pass parameters. Another way to pass parameters is in the body of the request. Let's add another call here, right? So if we were to say get countries by code, let's copy. I'm going to show you. For this particular example, I think it's only going to accept it in the URL here. But there is another way to do it. Again, you have to refer to the documentation to see whether parameters can be passed in the body. And if so, Bubble has a nice little form system set up where you add a new parameter here for every key and value pair. So I would say codes and then put in my comma separated list of codes there. Or another parameter like full text to have them work together. Sometimes parameters are just about filtering the response, such as, I want to see this sorted in a certain way, or I only want to see things created after a certain date. Again, refer to the documentation for it. For this particular API, the parameters do have to be passed in the endpoint. And so we would just work with this in the same way like we did with the dynamic name, right? So I would have a list that I need to provide. I could do one or more, but I would do, something like this, list of codes. The name that you put in here inside of the hard brackets is not passed over to the service. This is something that's just an internal ID for you, so you know what this dynamic field is for. But the value is what gets passed in. That's why those are in those curly brackets. They're kind of placeholders to say, hey, you can provide a list of codes here. So if I did US, FR for the US and France, I should be able to see those two countries come up as the response, and only those two. So first one I have US there. I'm going to scroll all the way down to the bottom to see the second. I'm seeing French details here. Yeah, and then there's France, and then there shouldn't be anything after that. Nope, that's it. All right, so this is how you can also work with parameters, just depending on if it belongs in the endpoint or in the body of the request. The last thing I want to point out is that some calls may need the same headers applied to it and even the same parameters. So to save yourself from having to configure that for each individual call, Bubble also has a way for you to add one set of headers, one set of parameters, right? However many are needed there. And those will be applied for you to all of the calls that you add. This is great if you're going to have a heavy integration with many, many calls. You can set those up in one place. There's less risk of error or inconsistencies. And if you ever need to make a change to one, you just make it change in one place versus all of your calls. They get added for you. So shared headers and parameters are very useful. That's only if all of the calls are going to have those same settings. You can, of course, mix and match. You may have some shared headers versus some independent headers and parameters that are defined per call. Now, that is it for the quick overview, the 101 on the API connectors, so that you understand what this window is all about, how to work with these dropdowns and what they actually mean, and how to make things available in your design. In the next few videos, we'll go in more detail with different authentication methods, working with dynamic values a little bit more, and connecting to some other popular services so you can see more examples. I do encourage you to play around with this with an easy API, just like REST countries, so that you can get a handle on it, see how you can manipulate all the details, take a look at their documentation, and try connecting to some of these other resources. I challenge you to set them up on your own and play around with the dynamic values, play around with how you can make your users in control of those responses as well. All right, everybody, we'll see you in the next one.